He shuffled into the courtroom in shackles, soaked through from last night's rain, sleeves torn at the elbow, boots mismatched and held together with cord. His breath steamed in the morning cold. The bailiff didn't look at him as he was led forward, his chain scraping faintly against the tiled floor. Spectators turned away as if to avoid the smell of damp wool and weeks without shelter. The man, gaunt but not broken, paused briefly before the defendant's table, waiting to be told where to sit. His name was Elijah Brooks. His crime, taking shelter in a locked train station after collapsing from exhaustion. He had broken the law, yes, but not to steal, not to vandalize, just to rest. The arresting officer's report noted that Brooks had been unresponsive at first, then belligerent. He'd refused to give his name. When they searched him, they found only an old VA card, bent and waterlogged, and a folded piece of paper with a list of names scribbled in block letters, half of them faded from rain. In the courtroom's fluorescent glare, Elijah looked like nothing more than another transient. The prosecutor flipped through his folder without interest. The defense attorney, appointed that very morning, tapped his pen on the desk with detached boredom. Elijah's eyes stayed low. He didn't speak, not yet. Not when they listed his priors, not when they described the incident, not even when they said, resisting arrest. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only armor that didn't crack. Judge Lena Halvorson peered at the name on the docket, her brow creasing. Something about it clung to her thoughts, tugging gently like the edge of a dream. Elijah Brooks. She said the name aloud once more, slowly this time. And then, for the briefest moment, she froze, before the memory returned, not hers, but her daughter's. 15 years earlier, in a sun-bleached forward operating base near Fallujah, Corporal Elijah Brooks had been known simply as Document, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice but somehow got everyone to listen. He had steady hands and an unnatural calm when blood sprayed and men screamed. The young Marines in his unit used to joke that even bullets avoided him out of respect. He moved through fire like someone born to do it, not for glory, but for necessity. One of them had said, Doc Brooks doesn't run into danger. Danger realizes it's in his way. The story Judge Halvorson's daughter had written her in a shaky letter home, pages blotted with dust and sweat, had told of a day in June. A routine patrol ambushed, IEDs exploding like thunder, chaos swallowing the air. 3 were killed instantly. 1, a young private named Hammond, was pinned beneath twisted metal and drenched in his own blood. The call came to fall back. Mortars were incoming. Everyone was running, except Brooks. He stayed. He slid into the wreckage, using his body to shield Hammond as fragments tore the sand around them. Against orders, Brooks had pulled the kid out piece by piece, crawling 100 yards under fire with Hammond's weight slung across his shoulders. He didn't stop until they reached the extraction point. His hands were raw. His arm had been grazed. He didn't mention it until everyone else was safe. Judge Halvorson remembered the name Brooks because her daughter had written it over and over again. She'd said, if he hadn't stayed, I wouldn't have lived. I owe my life to him. Now that same man sat before her, shackled and hollow-eyed, his former life buried under years of systemic neglect. She excused herself from the bench and stepped into her chambers, pulse fluttering. From the bottom drawer of her desk, she withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with time. It had arrived with no return address, just her daughter's name and an old field hospital's insignia in the corner. Her daughter had asked her to deliver it someday, if she ever found the man called Brooks. She returned to the courtroom and handed the envelope silently to Elijah. He stared at it without opening it. His hands trembled. The courtroom had gone still. Something about the moment shifted the air. The defense attorney finally stopped fiddling with his pen. The prosecutor lowered his folder. Even the bailiff tilted his head, unsure why the judge had paused proceedings for this silent exchange. Elijah Brooks, the judge said gently, please read that letter. He unfolded it with careful fingers, the paper soft with age. His eyes scanned the words, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, something in his posture changed. Not pride. Not relief. Something more fragile. Recognition. Her daughter had written, "You didn't know my name. But I knew yours. You saved my life. I named my son after you." The letter ended with a photo, faded but clear, of a baby boy in a striped onesie, smiling beside a woman in fatigues. The judge allowed a quiet moment before speaking again. "Court is recessed for 30 minutes. She rose and disappeared once more into her chambers. This time, she made a phone call. Within 25 minutes, a man in dress uniform stepped through the doors. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Rios, JAG Corps. He spoke directly to the judge, then to the court clerk, then finally approached Elijah. "You were never properly debriefed," Rios said. "Your commendation was never delivered due to lost records in the 2008 file purge. But we have it now. Your military history has been reinstated." The judge looked back at the prosecutor. "Given this new information, I am dismissing the charges. All of them. Immediately." Her voice had the soft, lethal edge of someone who had seen too much injustice tiptoe past her bench and had finally chosen a moment to strike. Elijah didn't move. The letter rested in his lap. The ribbons and medals meant less to him than the ink on that paper, the words that proved he hadn't dreamed the people he saved. That it had mattered. The public defender tried to say something congratulatory, but it caught awkwardly in his throat and became a cough. Elijah rose slowly, the chain of the shackles still on his ankles, but his back a little straighter now. Colonel Rios reached down and unfastened them with a key, letting them fall to the floor with a cold clink. "You're free to go," Judge Halvorson said, and this time, her voice cracked, just a little. Outside, the same rain still fell. Elijah walked into it, not as a ghost but as a man someone had finally remembered. He passed a man huddled under a bus stop awning, offered him his coat, and kept walking without waiting for thanks. His destination wasn't clear. It didn't need to be. He had the letter in his pocket, folded once more with reverence. It was enough to know that someone, somewhere, had named a child after him. Enough to know the stories whispered in his sleep had not been swallowed by silence forever. Elijah didn't return to the shelter that night. He didn't return to the bridge either. Instead, he rode the city bus until the driver changed shifts, dozing lightly as neon signs and boarded windows blurred past the fogged glass. The letter stayed tucked in his chest pocket, close enough to feel against his ribs. He woke at dawn on the final loop and stepped off somewhere unfamiliar, not because he had a plan, but because his body told him to move. Sometimes, surviving wasn't about making decisions, it was just about continuing forward. He found himself at the public library when it opened. The librarian gave him a cautious glance but said nothing. Elijah moved slowly to a corner computer station and sat down with a stiffness earned over years of concrete and cold. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. For the first time in a long while, he searched his own name. There wasn't much. A few scattered mentions, outdated VA listings, an old obituary for his mother, and, buried several pages in, a combat report summary from 2006. Corporal Elijah D. Brooks commended for valor under fire in Operation Phantom Fury. No photo. No detailed account. Just a name among many. But it was real. The world had tried to erase him, but here he was, footnote or not, still written somewhere. He clicked into the military records portal, using the login credentials handed to him by Lieutenant Colonel Rios. Slowly, his past began to unfold, training photos, deployment summaries, commendation paperwork. There, at last, was the Silver Star Award, marked undelivered. Elijah leaned back. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. He did neither. Just breathed. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with a badge that read, Nina, approached. "Sir?" she asked gently. Would you like a printout of that? Elijah looked up, startled. Yes, please. She returned a few minutes later with a printed page, slipped neatly into a manila folder. She also handed him a warm cup of tea. You don't have to stay outside anymore, she said. There's a program. Housing vouchers. You qualify now. He nodded, quietly grateful. The folder felt heavier than it was. Proof. Not just for courts or agencies, for himself. Over the next week, Elijah began piecing together fragments of a life. He filled out forms, endured long lines at the Veterans Resource Center, sat through interviews, and finally signed his name on a housing placement application. A caseworker named Jules took a liking to him, not in a pitying way, but with practical warmth. You're meticulous, she said after their third meeting. Most guys I see, they're too far gone to follow all this. You remember every date. Every form. That's rare. I remember everything, Elijah said simply. That's the problem. The apartment was small and basic, just one room, a hot plate, and a view of a parking lot, but it was his. He stood in the doorway for nearly 20 minutes before stepping inside. The silence felt different here. Less hostile. As if the walls, bare though they were, offered truce instead of judgment. He slept on a cot the first few nights, waking up stiff, startled by the absence of traffic or shouting. On the fourth morning, he bought a second-hand mattress and pushed it into place with great effort. That night, he didn't dream of mortar rounds. Elijah began to walk differently in the weeks that followed, still careful, still quiet, but without the bent, bracing posture of a man expecting hostility around every corner. He picked up small tasks for elderly neighbors. He fixed a broken lock for the woman next door. When asked if he was retired, he only smiled. Working on it, he'd say. But not everyone had forgotten him. A young reporter named Theo Tran, freelance but hungry for truth, had attended the courtroom hearing by chance. He'd come for another case entirely but stayed when the atmosphere shifted. Something about the judge's sudden pause, the silent handing over of a letter, the man in shackles standing taller by the end, it had hooked Theo. He started digging. Public records. Military files. Interviews with veterans. One name kept surfacing, Doc Brooks. Even after all these years, the Marines who had served with him remembered him vividly. One said, "He patched me up while I was screaming. Told me to shut up and breathe. Saved my leg. Saved others too. Last I heard, he disappeared after discharge." Theo published the story under the title, "The Man Who Stayed Behind." It spread fast. Not viral, but deeply. Veterans forums lit up. Advocacy groups called. One mother, whose son Elijah had dragged from an ambush, wrote an op-ed thanking him by name. Theo included a photo of Elijah from the court, still in damp clothes, but upright, letter in hand. Elijah saw the article a few days after it went live. He didn't recognize the man in the photo. He looked whole. Or at least like someone in the process of rebuilding. He printed it out and pinned it to the wall above his desk. Not out of vanity. As a reminder, he was still here. Then came the letter. This one wasn't old or yellowed, it was crisp and typed, with a Pentagon seal. It invited him to a private recognition ceremony at the courthouse. Optional. Quiet. No press. Elijah hesitated. He'd never asked for medals. He hadn't even known he was owed one. The silver star felt like a symbol of everything he'd lost, and everything he'd tried not to remember. But he owed it to the name still written on that folded paper in his coat. He called the number listed and said, "I'll come." He didn't sleep that night. Not because of nerves, but because of memories. They came softly, like waves against a ruined pier. Not violent. Just steady. He remembered laughter in the mess hall. The face of Private Hammond before the IED. The smell of motor oil and sand. He placed the old VA card and the thank you letter into a small wooden box and packed it in his duffel. This time, he chose his own clothes. A dark jacket, pressed shirt, tie he didn't quite know how to knot until he watched a video 3 times. He took the bus again, not out of necessity, but habit. And when he arrived, standing once more in front of the courthouse steps, it wasn't raining. Elijah paused at the foot of the courthouse steps, staring up at the same stone facade that had once framed him in chains. Today, there were no shackles. No bailiff sneers. No whispers from the benches. Just a man in borrowed dress shoes, a tie finally knotted, and shoulders no longer curled inward. He took a breath, slow and deep, and climbed the steps one at a time. With each step, the courthouse transformed, not a sight of judgment, but one of return. Inside, a modest group had gathered in the small ceremonial chamber: Judge Halvorson, Lieutenant Colonel Rios, Theo Tran, a few members of the Veteran Support Office, and a sharply dressed woman Elijah didn't recognize until she stepped forward. "Sergeant Dana Halvorson," she said, extending her hand. "We've met before. Fallujah. June 2007. Elijah blinked. The memory surfaced slowly: dust, fire, blood. And then her face, younger, streaked with sweat and ash. The woman he carried through the smoke. "You wrote the letter," he murmured. "I did," Dana said. "My son's name is Eli." They shook hands. No tears. No speeches. Just recognition, pure and without ceremony. Elijah's throat tightened. Not from grief, but from the strange weight of being remembered. The ceremony itself was brief. Judge Halvorson spoke first, her voice clear but steady. "This is not just a moment of honor. It is a correction. A necessary one. Sergeant Brooks served with valor, and his actions saved lives. The failure to recognize him sooner does not diminish what he did. Today, we acknowledge it, publicly, and permanently." Lieutenant Colonel Rios stepped forward and unrolled a narrow velvet case. Inside rested the silver star, gleaming under courtroom lights. "For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States," he said. "Sergeant Elijah D. Brooks." Applause followed, but it was soft, reverent. Elijah stepped forward, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. He accepted the medal, nodding once, then again, more slowly. There were no words in him at that moment. The years between then and now collapsed into a breath. After the ceremony, people drifted into small groups. Dana Halvorson and her mother shared quiet conversation. Theo scribbled notes into his battered journal. Elijah stepped aside to the tall courthouse windows, watching the city move past like it had every day he'd slept on its benches and sidewalks. Jules, his caseworker, appeared beside him with a paper cup of coffee. "How does it feel?" "Strange," he said. "Like someone else's story I just walked into." Jules smiled. "You're not done writing yours." The next weeks unfolded in surprising ways. The article by Theo gained traction, picked up by a national syndicate. Offers began to arrive: speaking engagements, interviews, veterans panels. Elijah declined most. He wasn't interested in reliving his trauma for applause. But when a local high school invited him to speak to students about service and resilience, he said yes. The gymnasium smelled of varnish and sweat. Teenagers sat slouched in rows of metal folding chairs. Elijah stood at the podium, uncertain where to begin. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded list of names. "These are the names of men I served with," he began. "Some made it home. Some didn't. Every one of them mattered. And every day since, I've carried them with me." He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. By the end, the room was still. Not in awe, but in understanding. Even the students who had come just to skip class looked at him differently. A few weeks later, a community center named its new veterans wing after him. Elijah was invited to cut the ribbon. The building stood just a block from where he used to sleep under an overpass. Now, inside its walls, others could find warmth, assistance, someone to listen. It didn't erase the years he'd lost, but it made them mean something. That winter, he visited the VA hospital voluntarily for the first time in years. This time, the process was different. His name triggered a flag in the system. A coordinator met him at the desk with a file already open. They'd read the article. They were ready to help. He enrolled in trauma counseling. At first, he said little. Just listened. Then one day, he spoke. "I'm tired of being angry," he said. "I want to remember without shaking." The counselor nodded. "That's where we start." In spring, Elijah was offered a part-time role at the center bearing his name. Not in administration, he didn't want a desk. But as a peer liaison, helping other veterans navigate the system that had once nearly erased him. He accepted. The work was hard. He met men and women fractured by experience, some too deep in their pain to reach yet. But when they looked at him, many paused. Something about his eyes, his silence, made them listen. He didn't preach. He didn't promise healing. He only said, "You're not forgotten." One morning, he came early to unlock the center and found a shoebox on the step. Inside was a pair of worn combat boots, laces knotted with careful precision. Beneath them, a note. "Doc Brooks, I read your story. I didn't know where else to go. These were my brothers. He didn't make it home. But I think he'd want you to have them." Elijah sat on the steps holding the boots for a long time. Then he rose, carried them inside, and placed them in the display case just past the entrance. He wrote a placard, "Donated in memory. All are remembered." By summer, he had a new rhythm: early walks, coffee with Jules, center work, weekly counseling, and occasional letters from Dana Halvorsen and her son. He replied each time, short notes, handwritten. When Eli sent a drawing of a medal with "For Doc" scrawled in crayon, Elijah placed it next to his own in the wooden box. He still didn't sleep through every night. Some shadows never left. But he had a bed. A name. A place. And when people called him Sergeant Brooks, he no longer flinched. By autumn, Elijah had become a quiet fixture in the community center. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear his medal, and rarely spoke about his past unless someone asked directly. He preferred fixing things: chairs with loose screws, coffee machines that sputtered, leaky radiators. Veterans came through the doors daily, some broken, others barely holding it together, a few ready to begin healing. Elijah saw pieces of himself in all of them. One afternoon, a young man named Marcus wandered in, wild-eyed and twitchy, his clothes soaked from the rain. He had the 1,000-yard stare Elijah knew too well. Jules brought him in, but he wouldn't talk. Wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. Just sat with his hood up, breathing like someone drowning. Elijah brought him coffee. Sat across the table. Didn't ask anything, just waited. Eventually, Marcus said, "They told me someone here would get it." "I might," Elijah said. "I've been there." "You don't know," Marcus muttered. "I don't need to," Elijah replied. "But I can listen." Marcus finally looked at him. Something passed between them, recognition not in the details, but in the damage. He started coming in regularly, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting. Elijah never pushed. He remembered the years when conversation felt like violence. Healing took time. Trust even longer. But Elijah had time now. Elsewhere, the article Theo had written continued to ripple. A documentary producer reached out, wanting to adapt the story. Elijah declined, firmly. "This isn't a story for cameras," he told them. "It's a story for people trying to stay alive one more day." Theo, now a regular visitor at the center, respected his decision. He stopped writing about Elijah and instead started volunteering, recording oral histories from other veterans who'd never had a chance to speak. Elijah helped him navigate military terminology, coached him on the right questions, the ones that didn't trigger, just opened. Meanwhile, Elijah's home began to reflect the change inside him. Where once it had been empty walls and silence, it now held books, a plant that miraculously stayed alive, photographs from the center, and a small shelf of folded letters and drawings from Eli in Vermont. He even adopted a stray cat, scarred, missing an ear, stubborn as hell. He named her Dusty. The cat rarely let anyone else near her, but she curled on Elijah's chest at night like she'd known him in a past life. One day in November, Judge Halvorsen stopped by the center unannounced. She carried a wrapped package and a small envelope. "This is from my daughter," she said. "She asked me to deliver it in person." Inside the package was a framed photograph, Dana, now out of uniform, smiling beside her son. On the back, "To document. For the ones who stayed. And for those who couldn't." The envelope held an airline ticket to Vermont. "She wants you to visit," the judge said. "No pressure. But I think it would mean something to her." Elijah nodded but didn't answer right away. He sat with the idea for days. What would he say? What would he see in her eyes? Would it feel like a reunion, or a reckoning? Jules encouraged him gently. "You don't have to go for them," she said. "You can go for you." In December, he boarded a plane for the first time in 2 decades. Vermont was colder than he expected. Cleaner, quieter. Dana met him at the gate with a hug that startled them both. They drove in silence to a modest farmhouse surrounded by brittle trees and white fences. Her son, Eli, met him at the door. 10 years old, gap-toothed, with his mother's intensity and an easy grin. "You're the real doc?" he asked. Elijah knelt. "I was." "You still are," the boy said simply. Over dinner, they didn't talk about Fallujah. They talked about Eli's science project, Dana's orchard, the stray dog they'd rescued last spring. That night, Elijah stayed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, more at peace than he could remember being. In the morning, Dana gave him something else, a small pocket knife, old and worn. "You gave this to me in Iraq," she said. "Said you'd come back for it." Elijah turned it in his hand, the initials still scratched into the handle. He hadn't remembered until she said it, but now it came back all at once. The act of handing it off, the promise to return. He swallowed hard. "You kept it this whole time?" Dana nodded. "I never forgot." He stayed 3 days. When he left, it was with a full duffel and a promise to return in spring. Eli gave him a snow globe with a handwritten tag, "For document, shake this if you get sad." Back in the city, something shifted. Elijah walked taller, his steps more certain. He started a journaling workshop at the center, free writing, no judgment, just expression. Marcus was the first to join. Then 2 more. Soon it became a weekly circle. They didn't all write. Some just sat, heads bowed, pencils hovering. That was enough. On the anniversary of the ambush that had earned him the Silver Star, Elijah held a private remembrance at the center. He lit candles for the names on his list. Read each aloud. No audience. Just him, Theo, Jules, Marcus, and a few others who understood. Not just fallen, Elijah said. Not forgotten. When the ceremony ended, Marcus stepped forward. Doc. I don't think I'd still be here if I hadn't come through that door. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. Me neither. That night, back at home, Dusty curled beside him as snow began to fall outside. Elijah looked at the snow globe on his shelf and gave it a gentle shake. White flecks danced inside it, like ash, or sand, or something softer. He closed his eyes. The battlefields were still there, behind his eyelids, under his skin, but they no longer owned him. He had returned, not just from war, but from the long silence that followed it. And this time, he wasn't alone. Spring came slowly that year, the kind of hesitant bloom that made every crocus feel hard-earned. Elijah walked each morning beneath budding trees, his steps quieter now, not from fear, but from respect. Respect for the ground, the wind, the life still unfolding. Some mornings, Marcus walked with him, talking less now but saying more. He'd moved into transitional housing and was thinking about finishing school. "You ever think about college?" he asked Elijah once. Elijah chuckled. "I used to think about survival. College didn't make the list. Maybe now it should." The idea followed him. A week later, Elijah applied for a local adult education program in counseling. Part-time. Nothing dramatic. But it felt like something forward. When asked on the form why he wanted to study, he wrote, "To help others find their way back from silence." Meanwhile, the center grew. Word had spread. Veterans from neighboring towns visited. Some stayed. Theo published a second story, not about Elijah this time, but about the writing group, titled Voices Reclaimed. It struck a nerve. Donations flowed in. The center upgraded its facilities. Elijah turned down an offer to manage operations, choosing instead to remain at the front door with the newcomers. He had a gift for those moments, first encounters. He didn't ask, "What happened?" or "What do you need?" He offered coffee, a chair, and space. "You're safe here," he'd say. It was enough. In April, Dana and Eli visited. They stayed a weekend. Elijah showed them the city, the library where he'd first found his name again, the center's new wing, the cafe that gave free meals to vets every Thursday. Eli, now 11, brought a notebook and wrote everything down. "I'm going to write your book someday," he declared. "Make sure I sound taller," Elijah said. Dana laughed. That night, over dinner, she asked softly, "Do you ever wish it had gone differently? After the war, I mean." Elijah was quiet for a long time. "I wish I hadn't disappeared," he said. "But if I hadn't, I don't think I'd be who I am now. I wouldn't know how to listen. How to sit with someone else's pain without trying to fix it. I had to lose everything to understand that." Dana nodded, her hand brushing his. "You never disappeared." "Not really." In May, a young woman named Tasha came to the center. She was recently discharged, eyes sharp but haunted. She had a child, a toddler named Maya, and nowhere to stay. Elijah arranged a hotel voucher the first night, then helped fast-track her housing. Over weeks, she warmed to him. "You're not like the others," she said. "You don't make me feel like a project." "You're not," he said. "You're a person. That's all that matters here." One morning, Maya reached for Elijah with sticky hands, laughing. He froze for a moment, memories of chaos, screams, heat pressing against him. Then he knelt, scooped her up, and felt her small heartbeat against his chest. Later, he sat alone in the break room, shaken. Jules found him. "Triggers?" she asked gently. He nodded. "But also something else. I forgot how much I missed this. Life. All of it. Missing it means you're part of it again." By summer, the center hosted its first community day, food trucks, music, resource booths, games for kids. Elijah wore a name tag that simply read, "Document, veterans brought their families." Some stood in the sun with faces tilted like they'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Elijah watched them and felt a rare peace. That evening, he returned home to find a letter in his mailbox, thick, official, from the Department of Defense. Inside was a formal apology, signed by the secretary himself, acknowledging the failure to honor his service post-discharge. Along with it, a retroactive increase in benefits and a personal note. Your service was never forgotten, Sergeant Brooks. Only delayed in being recognized. Thank you for carrying the burden with quiet courage. Elijah set the letter on the table. He stared at it a long while, then opened his journal. He wrote, "They say time heals. It doesn't. But time lets you carry the weight differently. You grow into the silence, until it becomes a kind of song. A hymn for the ones who stayed, and for those who didn't." As July deepened, Elijah began visiting local high schools again, this time with Marcus and Tasha at his side. They spoke not of war, but of resilience. Not of sacrifice, but of survival. And always, of listening. After one talk, a student lingered behind. "My brother's in the Marines," she said. "I'm scared he won't come back the same." Elijah placed a hand over his heart. "He won't. None of us do. But if he comes back, and someone meets him with kindness, not pity, he has a better chance." That night, he returned to the bridge where he'd once kept his uniform in a plastic bag. It was gone now, gentrified, turned into a park with benches and curated murals. Children played where he had once slept. He didn't resent it. He watched them run, their voices like the echoes of a life reborn. A few feet away, he saw a man huddled under a tree, ragged, watching the laughter like a stranger. Elijah approached, crouched slowly, and held out a small bag with a sandwich and water. "You hungry?" The man looked up, startled. "You a cop?" "No," Elijah said. "I've been where you are. Just figured you could use a hand." The man hesitated, then took the bag. Elijah didn't wait for thanks. He just stood and walked on. The path home was lined with trees in full bloom, petals drifting like quiet blessings. Dusty waited on the windowsill when he arrived, tail flicking with calm expectation. He scratched behind her ear and fed her before making tea. As he sat on his worn couch, the evening sun spilled across his floor. He reached for his notebook again. This time, he didn't write names. He wrote lives. The ones he'd touched. The ones who'd touched him. Not to mourn them. To remember. Still here.